Hello again. In this lecture I'm going to talk about one of the primary tissue types we haven't covered so far this semester. That is muscle tissue. I'm going to look at the structure of muscle tissue, how it's used to make muscular organs, and how it interacts with the skeleton and allows us to move. I'll begin with this slide, which outlines some basic concepts related to muscle tissue. Movement is a basic characteristic of living animals, including us. In humans we can move because the muscle tissue cells within us, they're also called fibers, will contract when stimulated. This contraction facilitates a range of functions such as locomotion, which is movement of our body. The ability of the muscle cells to contract will also contribute to the stability of our bodies when we're maintaining posture. Muscle tissue will also help move substances internally within us, for example, food in the digestive system or blood in the cardiovascular system. And muscle cells also generate a fair bit of heat, which allows us to maintain our body temperature at a stable temperature of about 37 degrees centigrade. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of muscle cells is that they contract when stimulated. Now, this is a key concept related to muscle tissue. Muscle cells get shorter when stimulated. It explains how we can move our bodies in relation to our environment or move substances internally. In particular, the contraction of muscle cells allows us to pull on body structures. When we're talking about the musculoskeletal system, we're talking about muscles pulling on bones and generating movement across movable joints. Contraction of muscle tissue will also allow us to alter the internal volume of certain organs, such as the urinary bladder, the heart, or the digestive system. Once again, it's important to note that muscle cells can only pull, they cannot push. The contraction of muscle cells involves the movement of fine strands of filamentous protein, actin and myosin. We'll talk about how these filamentous proteins operate during the contraction of muscle tissue later. What we'll talk about now are the different types of muscle tissue that exist in the body. There are three key types: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. This shows the three types of muscle cells we have within our body. There is cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle. They look different from one another and they do different jobs in different parts of the body. There are two key ways we tell one muscle type from another. Firstly, by the presence of stripes or striations, as you can see here. The other criteria is by whether the muscle is under voluntary or involuntary control. This means, do we need to think about it before we move it? Look at the muscle types in this image. We have cardiac muscle. This is present in the cardiovascular system only, in particular the heart. Smooth muscle is present in visceral organs, such as the digestive system. Skeletal muscle tissue is found in the skeletal muscle organs and integrates with the skeleton to allow us to move. Most of this lecture will be devoted to looking at skeletal muscle tissue and how it makes skeletal muscles. Now, it's important to stress that skeletal muscles are organs. They're made not only of muscle tissue but also other tissue types such as connective tissue. Skeletal muscle organs fulfill a range of roles, as I've already hinted at. Firstly, to allow us to move from one place to another, that's locomotion, manipulate objects, communicate through speech and also breathe, and also to maintain body posture. Skeletal muscles integrate with the bones and joints of the skeleton to create movement by forming lever systems. This image here shows the lever system concept. The load here is the point where the force is applied. The fulcrum is the movable joint, and the effort to move this load here is provided by the contraction of the skeletal muscle. Here's how the lever system works with skeletal muscles. It's showing you the arm here. The bones carry the load. Here, for example, we have the radius. Movement is possible because we have a movable joint involved in the system. This is a synovial joint, a hinge joint at the elbow. The muscle here, which is the Biceps Brachii, provides the effort to move the load. Now note how the muscle, this bicep muscle, is anchored at 2 points. The scapula up here and the radius down here. When stimulated, this muscle will contract and get shorter. This contraction applies force and moves the two bones closer together. In particular, the radius here will get closer to the scapula. This movement allows the body part involved to move. For example, flexion at the elbow joint will allow movement of the forearm here. In these next few slides, I'll look at how we make the muscle organs. And a key concept to remember is that it requires multiple tissue types. First of all, we need the muscle cells. These muscle cells need to be wrapped and reinforced with layers of connective tissue. We'll have a look at these layers of connective tissue which encase the skeletal muscles in the next few slides. Here, for example, we can see a discrete muscle organ wrapped by a layer of connective tissue. We actually call this the epimysium. Notice how it's continuous with the tendon here inserting into this bone here. If you look inside skeletal muscles, you can also see bundles of skeletal muscle cells or fibers, about 20 to 100 of these. These are bundled up also within discrete layers of connective tissue. We call these bundles of muscle cells fascicles. Now, it's very important to stress that these connective tissue wrappings are vital for the muscle function. They help hold the muscle cells together and anchor them securely onto bones that they are going to move. In this slide, I'll discuss skeletal muscle cells. Now, skeletal muscle cells are very unusual looking cells. Like neurons, they are particularly long. They can be up to 30 centimeters. They have distinct stripes, they're called striated, and this relates to the presence of the contractile proteins. They are multinucleated. Up to 100 nuclei can be present in one muscle cell. A skeletal muscle fiber also contains these distinct cellular structures. It has a plasma membrane, as any cell does. In this case, we call it the sarcolemma. The cytoplasm of muscle cells is referred to as the sarcoplasm. Myofibrils are long rod-like structures we can observe inside the skeletal muscle cells that contain the contractile proteins that are so important for the muscle being able to shorten and generate movement. These myofibrils make up to about 80% of the muscle cell volume. This image shows a muscle which is being cut, and then over here we have a magnified version of an individual muscle fiber or cell. Look closely, you can see the structures that I mentioned previously. For example, we can see the cell membrane that I referred to, the sarcolemma that's called. Notice also the nuclei at the edges here. There are 1, 2 and 3 indicated. Muscle fibers are multinucleated. Perhaps the most important feature to note is that the bulk of the muscle cell is filled with long protein rods we call myofibrils. These myofibrils contain the protein filaments that allow contraction of the muscle to occur. Now, if you look closely at the myofibrils, what you'll notice is that they are made of lots of repeating subunits. These are called sarcomeres. These are the basic functional units that allow the muscle cell to contract. Sarcomeres are composed of interlocking strands of filamentous protein made of actin and myosin. So these proteins interlock with each other. When stimulated by a motor neuron, in particular a somatic motor neuron, the filamentous proteins in the sarcomeres will slide over each other and the muscle cell will be able to contract. This shows the basic internal structure of a skeletal muscle cell. So here we have the individual muscle cell. Look inside the cell and we can see the long rod-like myofibrils that I mentioned before. It's important to notice that this is a protein rod. It is not the muscle cell. Sometimes students are confused by that. If we look closely at the myofibrils, we can see that they contain the repeating contractile units we call the sarcomeres. These are the ones that are made up of interlocking bands of actin, that's the thin blue line there, and the myosin protein, that's the thicker red band there. This shows a model of a skeletal muscle cell, and you'll see this in the practical. It highlights many of the structures I've just been talking about. This thing here is the individual muscle cell, not these rods here. So this is the muscle cell. Look at it and you can see the structures I've already mentioned. The sarcolemma, which is the plasma cell membrane. Multiple nuclei are evident if you look closely at this model. There is a layer of connective tissue. In this case, we call it the Endomysium. Of particular importance, we have the myofibrils, one of which is indicated here. These contain the contractile elements called sarcomeres. Notice also the motor neuron over here. So this is a neuron innervating this particular muscle cells. This will provide the signal for this muscle cell to contract. This shows the basic setup of a sarcomere. The key structural components are thin filaments of a protein called actin, that's the blue ones there, and thicker filaments of a protein called myosin, that's the red one here. Notice how on the myosin we have head-like structures. These make contact with the actin filaments and are important for allowing the movement to occur, which results in muscle contraction. Notice also how the filaments overlap one another. This is also critical for understanding how the sarcomeres allow muscle contraction to occur. Because skeletal muscle is made of different protein bands, myosin and actin, we get a stripy appearance or striated appearance in the tissue, giving light and dark bands. The dark bands are the myosin, the lighter ones are the actin. Notice also how long the skeletal muscle cells are. Here's a fibre here, it's quite long. We can also notice the nuclei pushed to the edges. We can also see connective tissue here. This is a layer we call perimysium. It helps reinforce the muscle organ. This figure here provides a good representation of how a sarcomere behaves during muscle contraction. When stimulated to contract, the actin and myosin filaments slide over each other, as we see here. When that happens, the entire sarcomere shortens. This is repeated throughout all the sarcomeres in all the myofibrils of the muscle cell, so the entire muscle will shorten. Body movements are coordinated by several areas of the brain. Many of the voluntary movements are initiated by motor signals that originate from a region of the cerebral cortex associated with the posterior aspect of the frontal lobe. That's indicated here. It's called the primary motor cortex. Now, specific parts of this region of the cortex look after muscles in particular parts of the body. For example, here we have a region looking after muscles of the face. Here's a region looking after muscles of the hands. And we get this pattern of a human here. This is called the motor homunculus. What you'll notice is regions needing fine control, such as the fingers and the face, have more of this brain cortex region set aside for them. An interesting characteristic of how skeletal muscles are innervated is that below the brainstem there is contralateral innervation. This means that in instances, the motor cortex on one side of the brain controls muscle actions on the opposite side of the brain. The crossover occurs in the brainstem or the spinal cord. However, this does not always occur for the cranial nerves, which are often ipsilateral with their motor innervation. A key concept to remember is that each skeletal muscle cell requires a signal from a somatic motor neuron to trigger it to contract. Now, a single motor neuron normally activates more than one skeletal muscle cell. The neuron and all the muscle cells that it activates is called a motor unit. Interestingly, the way a neuron communicates with a skeletal muscle cell is very similar to how neurons communicate with each other. In particular, there is communication via release of chemicals across a gap or a synapse, as we referred to before. The small gap that we can see between a neuron and a muscle cell is a synaptic cleft. So this is very reminiscent of the sort of communication that occurred between neurons. This shows the general setup of a motor unit. Notice the spinal cord here. We have an action potential being sent along somatic motor neurons towards muscle fibers in a skeletal muscle organ. Once the neurons approach the muscle fibers, they will branch and innervate several muscle fibers. We can see, for example, this neuron is innervating 3 and this one over here innervating 2. Each time one of these motor neurons has an action potential come down it, all the muscle fibers associated with this neuron will be stimulated to contract. Now, in areas where particularly fine control is required, for example in the hand, you'll have relatively small motor units, but if you don't require such fine motor control, the motor units can involve one neuron innervating many skeletal muscle cells. So that is how skeletal muscle tissue is set up. In this section, I'll look at some selected skeletal muscles. We'll look at the following things. We'll look at muscle shape and function, the general characteristics of skeletal muscles, how we name them, and the concept of functional skeletal muscle groups, and then we'll look at some individual skeletal muscles. Before we consider individual skeletal muscle organs, however, we need to consider some of the basic principles about how these skeletal muscle organs are set up. As indicated here, there are three basic principles that generally apply when understanding how skeletal muscles integrate with the bones and joints of our skeleton. Firstly, skeletal muscle organs will typically form attachments to bones of the skeleton. They will also cross movable joints, and they will initiate types of movements that are strongly influenced by the joint structure. In this next slide, I'll review a few terms we need to be familiar with when discussing skeletal muscle organs. Firstly, the origin. This is the point of attachment of a skeletal muscle to a bone. It remains relatively still when the muscle contracts. The belly is the thicker mid-region of the muscle. It often bulges out when the muscle contracts. Finally, the insertion. It's another point where the muscle inserts into a bone. This time, however, when the muscle contracts, the bone moves in response to this contraction. This diagram provides a good example of how muscles attach to the bones of the skeleton. We've shown here the Biceps Brachii, and over here we have the Triceps Brachii. Note the origins of the Biceps Brachii on the scapula. When the bicep muscle contracts, this point will remain relatively stationary. Notice how the muscle here crosses a movable joint between two bones, the hinge synovial joint at the elbow. Movement will occur here, so it'll be a hinge-like movement. The muscle here is also inserted into a second bone. We have here the radius. This bone will move when contraction of this muscle occurs. The movement of the bone here will then be observed as movement in a particular region of the body. And what we will notice is flexion of the forearm, possible because of the elbow joint. In this presentation, we'll make a lot of reference about how various muscles attach to bones. This shows examples of indirect muscle attachments. That is where the muscle is connected to the bone or another anchor point by a tendon strip or sheet. Tendons, as we can see here, are made of strong collagenous connective tissue. On the left-hand side, we can see here the calcaneal tendon that inserts the calf muscle, the gastrocnemius, into the calcaneus bone of the foot. On the right-hand side, we can see an aponeurosis. That is like a broad, flat tendon sheet. In this case, it's forming attachments for abdominal muscles. One thing you'll notice when looking at skeletal muscles is that they have unusual and at first quite difficult names to understand. However, there is a definite method to this naming system. Muscle names are based on ancient Greek or Latin languages and describe a range of features of the muscles, including, for example, their location. For example, if the term costal is in there, it refers to the ribs. The name can also describe shape. For example, deltoid is a reference to triangle. Size is often referred to in the muscle name, maximus, minimus, etc. The fiber direction can be referred to, rectus or oblique, origin number, biceps indicating two heads or triceps. Attachment locations can also be referred to. For example, sterno in the name indicates some association with the sternum. The action may also be indicated as well, flexion or extension. Here's an example of one of the ways we can name muscles. In this case, we're referring to the size of the muscle. Now, in your gluteal region, there are three muscles that connect the bony pelvis to the femur. These are the gluteal muscles, and you have a gluteus minimus, medius, and maximus. The first part of the name, gluteus, refers to the gluteal region, where the muscles are located. The last part of the name refers to the muscle size. The maximus, here, gluteus maximus, is the largest of the three gluteal muscles. By contrast, the gluteus minimus is the smallest of the three gluteal muscles. We can also name skeletal muscles on the basis of the number of origins or bellies that they have. Remember that the origin is the place where the muscle attaches to a point which will remain relatively stationary when the movement is generated. Here's a couple of examples of the nomenclature system based on the number of origins or bellies in a muscle. Here we have the Triceps Brachii. Triceps, 3 heads. This occurs because you have 3 origin points, 1 on the scapula and 2 on the humerus. So you have a long, lateral and medial head for this skeletal muscle. The biceps, the 2-headed muscle over here, has 2 origin points, both on the scapula. Muscles may also be named on the basis of their shape. For example, the rhomboid major is partly named on the basis of its shape, as we can see here outlined in yellow. Rhomboid major. It is representative of a diamond shape. Opposite sides are parallel and opposite angles are equal to each other. Classic definition of a rhombus. Now we'll talk about muscle function. Now remember, a key concept is that skeletal muscles can only pull, they can never push. Another important thing to note is that skeletal muscle organs normally don't act just by themselves. Typically they will act in a group, what we call a functional group, and the action of individual members within this group will contribute to a particular movement across a movable joint. I'll mention some specific functional groups of skeletal muscles in a little while. When muscles contract, we describe the significance of the movements that they generate. For example, we may describe a muscle as acting as a prime mover when generating a particular movement. Now, a prime mover is a muscle which provides the major force for a particular movement. A good example is shown here with the brachialis. It's a muscle in the brachium, that's the arm. It crosses the elbow joint, and when it contracts, it's a prime mover of flexion of the elbow joint. So the majority of the force to flex this elbow joint in this movement indicated here is provided by the brachialis. By contrast, antagonists are muscles which counter the action of a prime mover. This might seem odd, but in reality, antagonists help to control actions generated by prime movers. For example, the Triceps Brachii is an antagonist to the brachialis and also the Biceps Brachii. It prevents these prime movers from causing an overshoot of the muscle action across the joint. Antagonists also allow the joint to return to the original position once the movement generated by a prime mover has finished. So here we have somebody performing elbow joint flexion, and then the tricep will extend the elbow joint to return the limb to the original position. As I mentioned before, in most cases muscles don't act by themselves. Often you will find a group of skeletal muscles acting together in unison to generate a particular movement. These muscle groups are wrapped and supported by sheets of connective tissue called fascia, sheets of connective tissue. In these compartments there will also be the necessary blood vessels and nerves to service the muscles. So in a sense, the muscles like working together, like this team in a tug of war, to produce a specific movement. Good examples of muscle compartments can be seen in the femoral or thigh region. In this region we have 3 separate functional groups of muscles. There are, firstly, the anterior compartment, where we have prime movers of knee joint extension, in particular the quadriceps muscles. The posterior compartment contains prime movers of knee joint flexion, such as the hamstrings. The medial compartment contains prime movers of hip joint adduction. This slide shows these three functional groups of muscles in the mid-femoral region. Firstly, we have the anterior compartment here. This is the femur here. I should also highlight the femur there. So the anterior compartment here, we have the quadriceps muscles, 4 separate muscles. The posterior compartment, we can see here, that's indicated by green, that contains the hamstring muscles. They act as antagonists to the anterior group. The third functional group of muscles is the medial compartment, as we see here. This contains muscles which adduct the hip joint, bringing this lower limb back towards the body midline. In this next set of slides, we'll look at some examples of skeletal muscle organs in operation, particularly in the ability of them to generate movements of specific parts of the body. We'll begin by looking at a muscle that moves the head. It's called the sternocleidomastoid, and there are 2 of them, one on each side of the head and neck here, as we can see. The muscle originates from the sternum and clavicle, and the sternocleid is a reference to the sternum and the clavicle. It inserts into the mastoid process of the temporal bone, and that's where the mastoid part of the muscle name comes from. This muscle will initiate movements such as flexion of the head if both are contracting at the same time. It can also promote lateral and rotational movements of the head if just one of them contracts. In particular, if you contract here, it will turn the head towards the opposite side of the shoulder. Next, I'll discuss a muscle that moves bones of the pectoral girdle, that is, the clavicle and the scapula. The muscle is the trapezius. These are a pair of triangular muscles located on the posterior neck and thorax. The right trapezius is shown here. This muscle extends from the spine medially to the scapula laterally. It extends from the skull superiorly to the thoracic vertebra inferiorly, and it's capable of multiple actions. For example, it's important for stabilizing, raising or rotating the scapula, and it can also extend the head with the scapula fixed. So in that sense, it can operate as an antagonist to the sternocleidomastoid muscles. Next, we'll look at some of the muscles that can generate movement at the shoulder joint, and in particular, they have the ability to move the humerus bone. Here are 3 key examples. Firstly, we have the Pectoralis Major, a large fan-shaped muscle located on the superior surface of the anterior wall of the thorax. It's a prime mover of arm flexion. The deltoid, a large triangular muscle that forms your rounded shoulder masses, and it can abduct the shoulder joint, so you can have movement of the upper limb away from the midline of the body. The third one is the Latissimus Dorsi. It's a very broad muscle located on the inferior surface of the back, and it's a prime mover of arm extension. That would be the movement that would be associated with the downward swinging of an axe, for example. A key fact is all 3 of these muscles insert into the humerus and create movement at the shoulder joint. Each one of these muscles initiates a different type of action. This shows the Pectoralis Major in detail. It has a broad origin arising from the anterior surface of the clavicle, the sternum, and the cartilage of the 6th or 7th rib. The fibers then converge towards their insertion, a flat tendon about 5 centimeters in width, which attaches to the humerus. This shows the location of the deltoid. We have anterior, middle, and posterior fibers in this muscle. Anterior fibers originate from the anterior border and upper surface of the lateral clavicle, as we can see here. Middle fibers originate from the acromion of the scapula, and posterior fibers from the spine of the scapula. This muscle forms the rounded shoulder mass. This shows the Latissimus Dorsi in detail on the right-hand side of the body. We have another one on the left-hand side. See the extensive origin of this muscle on the thoracic and lumbar vertebra. The attachment of this muscle is via a broad tendon sheet we call the thoracolumbar fascia. That's that there. We also have attachments on the most inferior 3 or 4 ribs and the iliac crest down here, so quite a broad attachment of this muscle. The muscle fibers then converge to a tendon that inserts into the humerus. Here is another muscle that can move the scapula. It's called the Serratus Anterior. It's a fan-shaped muscle that has its origins on the superior ribs, and we can see that here on this side. There's another one on the other side. This muscle inserts into the medial aspect of the scapula, which is posterior to us, and we can't actually see that. The Serratus Anterior is occasionally called the boxer's muscle because it's a prime mover of the protraction of the scapula. That is, it pulls the scapula forward and around the rib cage when performing an action such as you would do when throwing a punch. So those are some of the muscles that can create movement at the shoulder joint. Now we'll look at some of the muscles that move the elbow joint, and here's a couple of very good examples. The Biceps Brachii, which we've already seen when we were talking about the nomenclature of muscles, and the antagonist to that, the Triceps Brachii. The Biceps Brachii, large superficial two-headed muscle of the anterior compartment of the arm, it inserts into the radius and promotes flexion and supination at the elbow joint. The Triceps Brachii has multiple origins, 3, 1 on the scapula, 2 on the humerus. It inserts into the ulnar, and it's a prime mover of extension of the elbow joint. This shows how the Triceps Brachii is set up. It's a 3-headed muscle and consequently must have 3 origins. One here, long head origin at the scapula. These other 2 heads have origins on the humerus. This gives the muscle a distinct 3-headed appearance that you can observe when it contracts. The muscle inserts into the ulnar and will cause extension of the elbow joint, allowing you to move the forearm when it's contracted. On the anterior aspect, we have the Biceps Brachii. As we've already mentioned, this muscle has 2 origins, both of which are on the scapula. The muscle inserts into the radius down here. Contraction of this muscle can assist with flexion at the elbow joint or create supination of the forearm. In this section, I'm going to talk about the muscles you need for respiration, that is breathing. Now, during the process of breathing, the thoracic cavity must increase and decrease in volume. This has the effect of increasing or decreasing the pressure of air in the lungs and allowing the air to move in or out. Breathing requires the use of specific sets of muscles to change the volume of the thoracic cavity. Firstly, we have the thoracic diaphragm. This is located at the inferior aspect of the rib cage, characterized by a large central tendon with several openings for things such as the aorta and the vena cava and the esophagus. We also have intercostals, which are layers of muscles located between the ribs, and they will help elevate or depress the rib cage. External intercostals are the superficial layer, internal intercostals are the deeper layer. In this slide, we can see the thoracic diaphragm. It's a dome-shaped muscular septum that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. It has a convex upper surface that forms the floor of the thoracic cavity. Its edges, as you can see here, consist of muscular fibers that originate from the edges of the rib cage, and then they converge towards this central tendon. You've got several openings here, for example, for the vena cava, the aorta, and the esophagus. The other figure here shows the internal and external intercostal muscles, muscles between the ribs. Now we'll move down to the abdomen and have a look at the major groups of muscles there. Here there are 4 major groups of muscles. We have the external obliques and internal obliques, the rectus abdominis, and the transverse abdominis. Each group of muscles has its own specific action, but together they are critical for the maintenance of many important functions. For example, they facilitate flexion and rotation of the vertebral column. They also form a firm but flexible wall that keeps the soft organs of the abdomen in place, particularly when standing erect. Contraction of these muscles can also assist exhalation by pushing the abdominal organs superiorly. This shows the four major groups of muscles of the abdomen. At each side, indicated here, there are three flat layers of muscles whose fibers originate posteriorly and insert into an aponeurosis anteriorly. The most superficial of these is the external oblique. Deep to that is the internal oblique here, and the deepest of all is the transversus abdominis. The tendons of all three layers of muscles converge to form a broad aponeurosis, the rectus sheath, which we can see here. The rectus abdominis is the other major muscle group in this area. It is a medial strap-like muscle extending vertically from the pubis of the coxal bone to the sternum superiorly. This muscle is divided into segments by tendons, we can see there, giving it that characteristic six-pack look. In these last few slides, I'll discuss muscles that move joints of the lower body. First of all, we'll look at a muscle that is a powerful extensor of the hip joint. It's called the Gluteus Maximus. It's a large muscle of a group in the gluteal region. It has origins on the sacrum and the coxal bone and inserts mostly into the femur. So it's an extensor of the hip joint, and a good example of this movement is when you stand after sitting, or when you are climbing stairs, or performing a squat as indicated in this image there. In this slide, I'll discuss a group of four muscles that act as powerful extensors of the knee joint. This is the quadriceps muscle group. It's located in the anterior thigh. You have four distinct muscles which are covered in sheets of connective tissue and have a common tendon that inserts into the tibia at a point we call the tibial tuberosity. The four muscles are vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, and the rectus femoris. These work together to allow you to extend the knee joint as shown in this image. This shows three of the four quadriceps muscles. Laterally, we have the vastus lateralis. Medially, we have the vastus medialis. And then in the middle of those, we have the rectus femoris. The fourth muscle of this group, the vastus intermedius, lies deep to these other muscles and is not visible in this image. An antagonist to the quadriceps muscle group is the biceps femoris. It's part of the hamstring group located in the posterior thigh. This muscle has two origins, one on the coxal bone and one on the femur. It inserts into the fibula, and it is a prime mover of knee joint flexion, so it operates as an antagonist to the quadriceps muscle group. So here we have somebody flexing their knee joint. And I'll finish this lecture with a skeletal muscle that moves the bones and joints of the feet. The one I'll select is the gastrocnemius. It's located in the posterior leg compartment. It's one of your calf muscles. The other main calf muscle is the soleus. Now the gastrocnemius has two heads, one lateral and one medial. This muscle has origins on the femur bone and inserts via a long calcaneal or Achilles tendon into the calcaneus bone of the foot. This muscle is a powerful plantar flexor. It allows you to stand on your toes. So plantar flexion will generate this sort of movement where you can stand on your toes. And that concludes our lecture on muscle tissue and the skeletal muscles.